If your goal is to continue losing fat, but you think that you'd like to start trying some different foods, my recommendation is to start with your standard routine and really just change one thing at a time. If you can change one thing at a time and stick with that for 2 weeks, you're going to have a really good idea if that one thing allows you to continue losing fat or if it basically hits the pause button on your fat loss. Now, some examples of things you might try, and these are some of the grey foods that I mentioned earlier, but this list is a little more extensive. So you might be trying things like olives, maybe some cottage cheese, macadamia nuts, almonds, bell pepper, or for the Australians out there, capsicum, some onion, maybe some small amounts of sweet potato or yam, maybe some parsnip. You might switch some red wine for some white wine. And you might also start having some natural protein powder if you're doing any kind of resistance training. So that's things with weights or, moving slowly with your own body weight, all those kinds of things. Now, they're just a few examples of grey foods. The thing that all of these has in common is that they're all really quite low GI. And what that means, of course, is that they have a low impact on your blood sugar. Now, you might be wondering, well, why didn't we just start with a low GI kind of lifestyle to begin with? And there's a good reason for that. Just because a food is low GI doesn't mean that it doesn't pack in a lot of food energy into a very small amount of space. So a really good example of that is nuts. So macadamia nuts and almonds as well, which technically are a seed, they both pack in so much energy into such a small amount of space that literally you could eat a small handful of them and you might already have eaten more energy than you could have, for example, from 2 cups of spinach and a decent sized protein portion. So there's a reason that some of these grey foods, although they don't affect your blood sugar, really need to be taken in pretty good moderation. So there's a bit of a list that you might want to have a think about, and of course, if you want to do your own research and look at some other low GI kinds of foods, there are some other things out there that you might want to try, but these really are the ones that I personally experimented with and that I've heard other people trying out that hasn't really impacted their fat loss results too much at all. Now, what you want to do over that 1 to 2 week period is check your progress in your weight and your measurements and your other indicators as well. So anything that you've been measuring, as well as measurements and weight, if you've been doing some body fat measurement, of course, do all that as well, because all of those results should factor into whether you think that this is something you can keep up or whether it's something that you're going to stop doing and change and maybe try something else. So that brings us on to the point where you would actually decide, are you going to pick a different thing to try? Or are you just going to stick with what you've got? Or maybe are you going to stick with what you've got and also add another thing on to test? Kind of see where that boundary lies for you in terms of continued fat loss. Now, all the way along, I really do suggest you stick with the meal template and look for some close variations to 1 or 2 of the items on that plate. We've talked about how to do meal substitutions and how to switch different foods in and out, and this is very, very similar, and that's why we've already talked about that, so that as we talk about customizing, you've already got those skills and you've already seen this before. But really the key here is that you're thinking about foods that you could do in a more permanent way, that could be more part of your permanent routine, whereas the meal substitutes really are kind of on a one-off or an every now and then kind of basis. So that's the approach to use if you're looking for continued fat loss, if that's your top priority.